Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist. I work in private practice in Harley Street, London. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Anthony Daniels. Anthony is a consultant psychiatrist. He's retired now, but his last posting was working at the West Midlands Poisons Unit in Birmingham. And he's published with his co-author, Alistair Vale, a fascinating paper in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. And the title of the paper is, Did Sir Winston Churchill Suffer from the Black Dog? And essentially, these two authors are raising a really interesting question, that it's kind of taken for granted that Winston Churchill suffered from depression to the extent that he even had a nickname for it called the Black Dog. But is it actually true? And I think there's a rather surprising answer as to whether it's true or not at the end of the paper. But let's start, Anthony, by asking you where the idea first comes from that Sir Winston Churchill suffered from serious depression. And you kind of lay the blame partly at the door of a very famous media psychiatrist of the day, Anthony Storr, who was kind of, I think, the equivalent of Anthony Clare of his day. But tell us a bit about his story and what he said about Churchill.
Well, I first of all, let me say that I don't blame him. A man can't be blamed for the consequences of what he wrote. But certainly he originated, I think, in the popular imagination that Churchill had severe depression. And he was a very beguiling writer. He was a very beguiling speaker. He was a very cultivated man. And his original essay, which I think was first published in 1969 and republished in 1980, really went more or less unopposed at the time. And it's a very beguiling essay that he wrote, and actually superficially quite persuasive. He tells us about Churchill's background, for example.
And he refers to Churchill talking about the Black Dog. So what was the Black Dog?
Well, that is, of course, a matter of dispute. According to some people, the Black Dog was an expression used by nannies quite often for when a child had a bad mood, was in a bad mood. And the nanny would say, the upper class nanny, or the nanny of the upper class, would say, well, you've got the black dog today. So it doesn't necessarily mean persistent and prolonged depression or any other mood.
So, in fact, it was an upper middle class saying amongst nannies, referring to people being a bit grumpy, actually. It wasn't actually a term that indicated you were clinically depressed.
Yes, I think that is, at any rate, that is what Colville, the private secretary, says, or the secretary of Churchill says. Yes.
Now, another eminent modern doctor and writer, Lord Owen, writes a book about the link between leadership and mental illness, or between the notion of psychopathology in politicians. And he seems to be a big fan of the idea that Churchill suffers from clinical depression. And you point out that a lot of these other sources are referring back to Anthony Storr. Yes. So Anthony Storr kind of gets the ball rolling, and it turns into an avalanche.
Yes, and something, if you like, enters the culture, and it becomes true merely by repetition. And this is not the only instance of something like that happening, but I think it's a good instance of it happening.
So the first,
and incidentally, Lord Owen was far from the only person who has accepted Storr's story.
Yes, you mentioned several other writers. Andrew Solomon, who wrote a very, very famous and important book on depression called The Noonday Demon and Anatomy of Depression, and lots of other books. Now, you actually comment on the end of the paper why people might be motivated to see depression in a great man like Churchill. Could you comment a bit on why people might be motivated to do that?
Well, this, of course, is highly speculative, and I can't prove it in any scientific way, but I think there are two main opposing reasons. The first is that we do like to show that great people have feet of clay, or at least are very vulnerable. And we like that. On the other hand, we also want to say to people that a psychiatric condition such as depression does not mean that you can't get on in life. We want to remove stigma attached to it. So there are these two things which have made it very convenient, if you like, to say that Churchill had severe depression.
There's another thing that you allude to in the paper, which is the notion that when people are extraordinary, in some way we want to psychopathologize that. We want to try to figure out what is the basis of their extraordinariness, and we seem to look into psychiatry for that. But people can be extraordinary without being psychopathological.
Yes. Unless you, well, if you psychopathologize anything that is not normal in the statistical sense, then of course it becomes true that everybody who is in any way abnormal it has some psychiatric condition. If I may refer to my own self, I buy an enormous quantity of books, far outside the normal range, I would say. But that doesn't mean it's psychopathology. At least, I don't think so. My wife might think it is, but I don't think so. So, but we do have a tendency to psychopathologize what is abnormal in the statistical sense. And of course, Churchill's life was extraordinary. It was a very, very extraordinary life.
And that takes us to an essential question, which is if you're going to try to figure out whether someone has a diagnosis, you get into almost a philosophical question, which is the essence of that diagnosis. What is it that you have to have in order to qualify for the diagnosis? And how do people fall into the category or not fall into the category? And of course, there's a lot of debate within psychiatry around that precise point. And although there are these manuals like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the ICD, International Classification of Diseases, who've attempted to manualize diagnosis, give clear-cut criteria, like with one of them, prolonged low mood over 2 weeks, there is still a sense in which the categories are a bit arbitrary. So what's really fascinating about your paper, you burrow into the question, which is that it's actually very difficult to be clear sometimes about diagnosis because of this problem of what is the essence of it to be psychiatrically ill.
Yes.
I wonder what your response is to that point.
Well, there I would say this, that one must surely have some idea of what is an appropriate response to circumstances. So one of the reasons that people say that Churchill was depressed was that occasionally he was very gloomy about what had happened. But of course, he had a life in which many terrible things, he experienced terrible things, he saw terrible things happen. And if we don't expect such a man's mood to change according to circumstances, that would itself be a bit psychopathological. After all, let's take the episode of the Gallipoli adventure, if one calls it that. It resulted in the deaths of 100,000 people at least, fairly equally divided between the Turks and the Allies. And it was, of course, a disaster, a military disaster for the Allies. And if Churchill had not been a bit gloomy after that, one would have thought of him as a psychopath, actually. But every time that he was gloomy, and he had many things to be gloomy over, after all, the Second World War was also a cause of gloom, he was very resilient, and his mood changed. But I don't think there's any evidence that there was any prolonged depression. And I would say that his reactions were normal in the circumstances. Now, we've got to have some idea of how people react normally to very difficult circumstances. And if we just say, as you pointed out, that someone who is depressed for 2 weeks, unhappy, gloomy, miserable for 2 weeks, one can't envisage circumstances in which that is a normal response, then I think in a way we have lost our humanity. Oddly enough, psychiatrists have come to be almost uniquely unable to recognize what is human.
And that is one of the reasons why this paper is so fascinating, because how do we work out, and the challenge of Churchill's life, given what an extraordinary life it was, the boundary between normality and disease when it comes to psychiatric disorder? And that's another reason why I think this is a fascinating paper. Now, I think you take the view that if you're really suffering from a serious psychiatric disorder, it's a functional approach, yours, which is that you oughtn't to be able to function. You oughtn't to be able to go to work. You oughtn't to be able to do the duties of a husband or a father. And basically, your paper is saying there's no evidence that for long periods of time, Churchill was incapacitated. In fact, this is a man who, for most of his life, had extraordinary capacity, not incapacity. And when you examine the evidence from Churchill, his wife, relatives, people close to him, his secretaries, his doctors, no one is giving an account of a man who disappears off disabled for long periods of time. Quite the opposite. They describe a man who's full of energy and is usually functioning. Would you agree with that perspective on your paper?
I agree that we do, but this is all within a background of no real account of his mental state, and oddly enough, no doctor ever described his mental state. So what I would say is that prima facie there's no evidence of depression because he did function. If you were able to show by means of an account of his mental state, such as any psychiatrist tried to elucidate, that he was in fact depressed, then I might change my mind, or we might change our mind, the two of us. But in the absence of any such account of his mental state, which indicates depression of any severity, I would say that the fact that he was able to function at such a high level would be against a diagnosis of serious depression. So it depends really whether you think that the onus is on the diagnoser to show what it was that caused him to say that Churchill was depressed. And I would say the onus is on those to show his symptoms, not for someone else to say he didn't have symptoms.
So one of the first places you look in your paper is in what Winston himself writes about in terms of himself. So in terms of his own writings, you argue there's very little evidence. He refers to the black dog, in fact, surprisingly infrequently. There seem to be only 2 allusions to the black dog in all of the copious writings that Churchill did about himself. Could you say a bit about that?
Well, there were many millions of words, of course, that he wrote. But he does talk, I've forgotten how many times, but very, very few times that he talks of the black dog. And he makes clear, actually, that it didn't really last very long, and he could be pulled back from gloominess very quickly and very easily by talking to his wife, for example, just by talking to his wife. And this does not seem consistent with any serious degree of depression to me.
Now, what about evidence from his own family? You marshal some of that evidence. Again, the evidence is thin that they regarded him as suffering from prolonged periods of depression.
I don't think they did think of him as suffering from long periods of depression, and overwhelmingly they thought that he was able to overcome his gloomy moods pretty quickly, actually, as did his friends. So unless one expects people to be completely flat in their mood, to have the same mood the whole of their lives, I don't think one can diagnose depression in Churchill.
Now, let's turn to a major tranche of the evidence, which is Lord Moran. Lord Moran was Churchill's doctor, his personal doctor, I think, and accompanied him on many of his trips abroad. Now, let's talk a bit about their relationship. I take a view, which I'm sure you may run screaming from the room over, that Lord Moran stopped behaving like a proper doctor, if I can put it that way, because he got a little bit entranced by the fact he had such an amazing celebrity patient, and he crossed the boundary because of that. And that's a grave danger for most of us doctors, that if you have a famous patient, that you lose track of how to maintain the correct doctor-patient relationship. But what are your thoughts about that?
Well, the first is, of course, that for quite a long time, Churchill was Moran's only patient. And therefore, it's extremely unlikely that a relationship like that, a doctor-patient relationship, would be a normal one. I mean, if you had only one patient, and furthermore, you were expected to travel with him on ships and aircraft and be with him at all times and be available at all times, your relationship would not be the same as with a patient whom you saw in outpatient. So it was inevitable that it would be a peculiar relationship. That's the first thing. Secondly, of course, Moran was a witness to enormous events. And I think it would be superhuman, it would have been superhuman of him if he had confined himself only to the clinical aspects of his relationship with Churchill. Of course, there was also the enormous furore. I can just about remember it. Well, I do remember it over the publication of this book, because it was of his great fat book about Churchill, because it was regarded as unethical. He did not have the permission of the family, and he revealed an enormous amount of material about Churchill, which, if his doctor-patient relationship was a normal one, he would not have revealed. He could not have revealed. So he really thought that he was a historian, I think, rather than a doctor, or he was perhaps both. And so I agree with you that it's a highly peculiar relationship.
Let's talk a bit about the publication of that book, which is basically almost a publication of the case notes of Churchill's.
Well, that's not quite true. It's not case notes in the sense of being contemporaneous.
Yeah, but it's an account of the medical treatments that Churchill got from Lord Moran.
Well, a lot of it is retrospective.
Yeah,
it's not quite clear what is in the book. It's not clear what was contemporaneous and what was not. So it's not a set of notes. It's not, if you were doing for example, a medico-legal case, you would look at the contemporaneous notes and say, well, this is a medical record. But this book is the book that Lord Moran wrote, was not that. And in fact, there's evidence that he altered the records for his own purposes, for literary and other purposes, and actually wrote things in retrospect. So it's not a contemporaneous record. It's not like looking in someone's hospital notes.
And did he get into trouble? Because one thinks today that the General Medical Council would pursue you as a doctor if you published this kind of material today. I don't know what you think.
Now here I'm a bit hazy. I did read the one biography of Lord Morton, and he was much criticised, but I don't think he actually got into any disciplinary difficulties. But in any case, he was not a highly active doctor. In fact, he was was more a medical politician than doctor.
Now, one of the things that's very interesting is his prescribing to Churchill before major speeches of amphetamines. And this seemed to clear up what Churchill referred to as a kind of muzzy feeling in his head. Now, this is the bit that I think we come closest to the possibility of depression, because amphetamine, if I got this right, was a treatment for depression sometimes. Back then, before antidepressants arose. Not a very good treatment because it can be an addictive drug. But what are your thoughts about this prescribing?
Well, the first thing is that it was prescribed only, I think, in to begin with, in the 1950s, the early 1950s. So it wouldn't really affect the diagnosis of what Churchill was like before then. But in fact, of course, by then Churchill was in a declining physical state, and he needed perking up. And in the circumstances, I don't think it was a terribly wrong thing for Morton to have done. He didn't prescribe, as far as I am aware, he didn't prescribe in such a way that Churchill became addicted. So it actually worked. Now, we wouldn't do it today, but then we are very closely regulated today as to what we would do. But as from the point of view of flexibility, I think what Morton did was not terribly wrong as far as that is concerned. But I don't think the prescription of amphetamine can be said to be evidence that Churchill was depressed. After all, in 1953, when he was first prescribed it, he was already quite an old man.
But what I think is interesting is that today, one of the ways, in a way, slightly circular, that doctors make the diagnosis of depression is giving someone an antidepressant, and if they cheer up, then they were depressed. And if you give an antidepressant to a normal person, inverted commas around the word normal, it's not supposed to have any effect. And if I recall correctly, amphetamines were used in that kind of diagnostic way. If you cheered up dramatically on amphetamines back in the 50s, it was a way of making the diagnosis. And what I'm saying is that it helped Churchill give his speech, but Churchill didn't come back to Lord Moran and said, listen, this drug's amazing. It's had a profound effect on my mood, and maybe I could take some more of it. It was the fact that didn't happen that I think lends weight to the idea that Churchill really wasn't suffering from depression.
Yes, the other thing, of course, is that Lord Moran was never worried about his depression. He didn't actually suggest that he should see a psychiatrist, nor did he prescribe anything for him. Not that there was very much, but I'm sure doctors in those days did prescribe things for people who were depressed. He used amphetamine simply as a kind of prop or a method of increasing Churchill's declining energy levels. And it's understandable that his energy levels had declined by that age. But certainly Morton in his book never, of course, describes the mental state of Churchill in any useful way, but he never appeared to be worried about his depression. And of course, Churchill was anxious during the war and at other times. But again, what would one say of a prime minister with bombs falling all over the place who wasn't anxious?
Now, one of the things that Lord Moran does, and I think Anthony Storr does it much more, is try to psychoanalyze Churchill and come up with a theory going back to his childhood to explain his psychopathology. And Anthony Storr, I think, does this more, according to your paper, than we think that Lord Moran does it, but both do indulge in it a bit. But let's go back to Storr's psychoanalytic theory, which is about the idea that Churchill was seen as a failure by his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, and was constantly spending the rest of his life trying to compensate for this sense of inferiority engendered by his father.
Yes, well, I mean, it sounds a plausible a plausible theory. I mean, it's intrinsically not absurd or anything like that. But it's very difficult to know how many people in Churchill's situation would have become depressed. I think, in any case, to argue from the etiology to the diagnosis is wrong. You have to establish the diagnosis first, not say, well, he had the factors that would explain the diagnosis, and therefore he had the diagnosis. You have to establish first that he was depressed. It's no good arguing that he was depressed because he had that background, if in fact he was never depressed.
So let's come to evidence from Violet Bonham Carter. Who was Violet Bonham Carter, and why is her evidence important?
Well, she was the daughter of the Prime Minister, Asquith, who was very close to Churchill. Both Asquith and Violet Bonham Carter were close to Churchill, and she observed him very from very close up to 1916, and this was a period where, of course, his diagnosis of depression was supposed to have been established, and she never saw anything, at least in the book that she wrote. She doesn't say that Churchill was depressed in any way. Now, there are two things you could say about that. She might have been trying to protect his reputation, and of course her memory might have been fallible, because she was writing 50 years later. But still, one can only use the evidence that one has. And she did know him very well. And she does, in her memoir, recount anecdotes which are against the idea that Churchill had prolonged low mood. So that, for example, he was gloomy after Gallipoli. His career, he thought, might be at an end. His career as a public figure might be at an end. He didn't know, of course, what was going to happen in the future. But he thought his career was at an end. He was disgraced. He was sent out to France, or he went out to France as the commanding officer of a battalion, which he did extremely well. And the fact is that he was very resilient. And in the evening, he said that he was finished, and in the morning he was ready to go again. This is not a picture of depression.
Okay, what about some other people? Evidence from Sir John Colville. Who was Sir John Colville?
He was the secretary of Churchill, and he observed him very closely, and he never saw him really depressed for any length of time either. Of course, he saw he had moods, but I think that would be true of all of us. So there's nothing in what Colville says that would suggest that Churchill was depressed for any length of time.
What about other doctors besides Lord Moran? You referred to two other doctors.
Yes, Lord Brain, for example, made notes about him, much more clinical notes than Lord Morton, and he doesn't talk about depression except insofar as he says that he's a bit he had melancholia, but I think he meant he was melancholic rather than that he had melancholia in the sense of deep depression. And he saw, I think he saw Churchill 20 times, in fact, and never remarked on depression.
So let me do this terrible thing and challenge you a little bit. Yeah. There are other explanations, despite your meticulously researched article, for for some of the things that you're saying, that doctors miss the diagnosis of depression all the time, particularly non-psychiatrists, with all the best will in the world. It's a difficult diagnosis to make. So my first counterpunch will be, you're right, these doctors did not maybe spot it or present evidence for it, but maybe they were missing it, and that happens all the time. And not only were they missing it, but they were motivated to miss it, because Churchill, being the man he was, who on earth wanted to bell the cat, to use an old saying? Who would want to say to Churchill, listen, I think you should go and see a psychiatrist. I don't think you're very well. I mean, that's a problem that dogs psychiatric diagnosis today, that people don't want to confront a patient with the diagnosis.
Well, I would. The first thing I would say about that is that Morton didn't seem so much in awe of Churchill that he didn't say to him things that Churchill didn't want to hear. But I think the fundamental question here is that of the onus. If you say that Churchill suffered from depression, suffered from a disease, it is up to you to show the evidence. Now, of course, the evidence, he's not alive, so we can't examine him now. All we can do is examine the historical evidence. And the historical evidence doesn't suggest that he was depressed. What you're saying is perfectly true, of course. He could have suffered from depression. It might have been covered up, but there is no evidence of that. And after all, the fact that the supposed fact that he was depressed is now taken almost for granted. I think there are websites devoted to the problem of depression, and quite a few of them use Churchill as an example of a man who was depressed. What we're saying in this paper is that the onus is on those who say that he was depressed to show that he was depressed, is not on the side of people who say he wasn't depressed to show he wasn't depressed. I mean, if for example, one said that Churchill suffered from a fractured skull at some point, one would say, well, where's the evidence for it? And you wouldn't just say, well, once he fell off a horse, and therefore he had a fractured skull. And I think the same would be true of the diagnosis of depression. It's really up to those to say he was depressed, to show that he was depressed. And there might be fairies at the bottom of the garden. It's very difficult to prove a negative.
But I think your paper is about something deeper, which is very important for medical students and young psychiatrists in particular to get their head around, which is that the title of the paper is, Did Sir Winston Churchill Suffer from the Black Dog? And one of the things I think that comes out of your paper is people say things like, I've got this thing, it's a black dog, or even patients go to their GP and say, I'm depressed. The onus on the doctor, if they really want to get the diagnosis correct, is not to leap into the assumption that you understand what the patient is referring to when they use the word depression or the word black dog. Well, your job is to ask them, well, what do you mean by that? What are you referring to? And to burrow into their account of their experience a bit more. And I was trained in a tradition at the Maudsley Hospital that emphasized this point. You make no assumptions about what people mean when they refer to their mental states, and you burrow into it to get at what they mean. But increasingly in today, when most psychiatric diagnoses are made by GPs, you only have 10 minutes with the patient, a diagnosis is done in a very slapdash manner, because people use words like I'm anxious or I'm depressed, and everyone just assumes that means they've ticked the box and they've got the illness. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree entirely. I mean, actually, there's a very interesting phenomenon, and that is the disappearance of the word unhappiness from the English language. How many patients come and say, I'm unhappy? I think none. Practically none. So that and this is a very significant social phenomenon. Because what it means is that unhappiness is now experienced or expected to be an illness. And I think to some extent psychiatrists have brought this on themselves. And they treat unhappiness as if it is in itself abnormal or illness. And you're quite right, we very quickly assume that someone is depressed who says he's depressed. And part of it, of course, is that we are afraid of missing a real depression which would respond to our treatment. We are much more pleased about one person who we could have missed but didn't miss than we are about 99 people who are, for example, given antidepressants unnecessarily. And all the doctors who saw Sir Winston Churchill didn't delve very deeply into the question of depression. That's all perfectly true. And I don't think, actually, he would have welcomed it very much, because he would have immediately grasped that people were suggesting that there was something psychiatrically wrong with them if they had delved into him very deeply. And it's interesting, one of the interesting things, he wrote a little book, or originally I think it was an article, but he wrote a little book about his hobby of painting. And he was a good amateur painter. His paintings now sell for enormous sums of money, but I think mainly because they're by him rather than because of their intrinsic artistic merit. He was much better than average, but still he was not a great painter. But he said of his painting that it was a way of restoring his equilibrium, his mental equilibrium. And actually his insight into the psychology of painting, that it was an activity completely different from all his other mental activity, but which nevertheless employed a large part of the or mental faculties, important mental faculties, and that this was extremely important to him. Well, this seems to me to be a rather acute observation on his part. So I agree with what you said. I think the diagnosis of depression is made in a very shallow way these days, and I don't know what your experience is, but I don't recall many patients saying to me or using the word unhappy. I am unhappy.
I think you're making a very profound and excellent point. But the final thing I want to discuss with you is that diagnosis traps psychiatrists into a very impoverished view of the human spirit. There's a sense in which psychiatry ought to be able to get a sense of Churchill as a tremendously interesting and great character without falling into the trap of having to make a diagnosis. And we see that increasingly today. I get asked by some occupational health department to assess someone. If I write a report saying, I think they have the features of, let's say, Asperger's syndrome, but they don't fully fit all the features. So I think they haven't got the diagnosis, but they have features of it. If I'm trying to feel out a way of describing someone, but I don't actually arrive at a formal diagnosis, occupational health departments and insurance companies and so on get very annoyed. As far as they're concerned, you either have it or you don't have it. And that's what they see psychiatrists as there to do. If you try to say, well, this is what the person is like, you try to capture them, if you don't hit them with to make them force them into a diagnosis, you're not doing your job. And there's a grave danger psychiatry ends up being this process of just categorizing people. I mean, the psychoanalysts, for all their failings, were endeavoring to do that. They were trying to capture what it was like for that person to be that person. And we've lost that a bit. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I think the DSM actually is largely responsible for what we get now is kind of checklist psychiatry. You have a certain number of symptoms, and therefore you fit into a category, and therefore the treatment is this or that. When you actually add up, as I did when the DSM-5 came out, I added up all the prevalences given. And really, I came to the conclusion that almost everyone must have a psychiatric diagnosis. Because actually you can get up to 35% of the population have personality disorders if you add up the prevalences of the personality disorders, and that's just the personality disorders. And so I think there's a kind of dehumanization, if you like, of psychiatry, which and it's become extremely mechanistic. And part of the reason for that is that in the United States, as you know, you only get reimbursed if you have a diagnosis according to DSM-5. And in this country, in our civil litigation system, you only get compensation for any psychiatric or psychological damage if you have a diagnosis. And therefore the tendency is that to fit people into the Procrustean bed of contemporary psychiatric diagnosis. So I agree very much with what you're saying.
And ultimately, one of the big take-home messages from your paper, which is something I think at the heart of all good psychiatry, is be cautious about diagnosis. Patients come and tell me they were diagnosed with this, that, or the other, and I just don't take it for granted. I ask them lots of questions just to make sure that I agree with that diagnosis. But increasingly, in the mechanization of the hectic pace of the health service, people arrive and say, well, 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with this thing, and everyone just assumes that diagnosis was correct. When it may not be. And so this notion of being cautious and re-examining diagnoses is extremely important in my view. And I think your paper establishes that point beautifully, but with the example of Churchill and this folklore myth that he had depression.
I think it's especially important in circumstances, cultural circumstances, in which people use psychiatric terminology. I use the example of depression. Everyone talks of depression now. So it's entered the common vocabulary, and if we just accept people as depressed who say they're depressed, then I'm afraid I think psychiatry has lost its way.
Well, Anthony Daniels, has been delightful talking to you. The name of the paper again is Did Sir Winston Churchill Suffer from the Black Dog? It's published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. The authors of the paper are Anthony Daniels and Alistair Vale. And Anthony, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you very much.